I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Inez Stepman.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Today, we're going to be covering the latest news from the Bolton Indictment, the indictment of John Bolton. I will be walking us through a series of scandals involving this Maine Senate candidate who has become the left's favorite hero. Inez will give us the latest on the New York City mayoral race, including calls for Curtis Sliwa to drop out in some polls and upcoming debate. And then Ben will close us out on whether Congress has finally developed the stones to impeach rogue judges. So with that, I will kick it over to Will to start us off.
Yeah, thanks. So last week, former National Security Advisor John Bolton was indicted in a Maryland federal district court. He was indicted for essentially, it's an 18-count felony indictment, 8 counts of transmitting national defense information and 10 counts of unlawfully retaining national defense information. These relate to when he was National Security Advisor in the first Trump administration. So the conduct here is remarkably brazen, actually. From the beginning of his term as National Security Advisor, he was retaining national defense information. He was basically taking copious notes whenever he was in meetings and wherever, and immediately sending them to his relatives. I believe it is his wife and his daughter, for custody and for editing. And the ultimate product of doing all this note taking and editing during his term was that he was able to put out a book called The Room Where It Happened, which was a 500-page book detailing his experience in the Trump White House. That book came out 3 months after he left the White House, had already at the time, there were questions about whether he properly took care of classified information. This indictment makes clear he did not. He basically transmitted this stuff over unsecured AOL servers and through a commercial messaging app, and in the hands of his wife and daughter, who did not have a security clearance and had no right to access any classified information. So it's a really straightforward indictment. You see a lot of people out there saying that this is lawfare, this is ridiculous, but the other indictments have been perfectly sound. The Comey and James indictment, this one's even more so. There were no fights among the District of Maryland line prosecutors to push back and not bring this indictment. Everybody looks at this conduct and is like, this is exactly the kind of brazen mishandling of national security information that gets somebody indicted. And he's on, you have clips on him on television, going after Trump for the same thing, when Trump actually at least had a reason to have those documents because he was the president of the United States. Bolton knew better. Bolton damn well knew better, actually. He knew that he wasn't doing the right thing when he was transcribing all these documents and handing them to his family. So it's a really amazing and brazen thing. I think it's a really good thing the guy's indicted. He played with fire really, really aggressively. And the whole reason this got discovered is because his emails with this classified information were discovered in the custody of the Iranian government after apparently the Iranian government hacked his email account. Well, that shouldn't have happened because this information never should have been outside of a secured server. But it was because Bolton mishandled classified information. So very justified, and I don't know what you guys think, but I'm hoping he goes to jail for this.
I agree. It's a very straightforward indictment. Two of my favorite parts were the Iranian hack that you mentioned, Will, and specifically the fact that he informed the FBI that his private email was hacked, but he did not apparently tell the FBI that this private email address was being used to transmit all of this classified information and national security secrets. And then the other part that I found really interesting in the indictment and kind of petty from the Trump administration in a quite funny way was they included, I believe it was communications that John Bolton had made on the same email address, criticizing somebody else for mishandling classified information. So that's kind of the fact chain that they included to prove that Bolton knew that his behavior was wrong and that he was acting unlawfully because he had criticized somebody else for effectively doing the same thing. It seems pretty cut and dry to me based on both the indictment itself and all of the analysis that I've read. And is probably, I think, one of the strongest, if not the strongest case so far we've seen in this line of indictments for people who were, yes, prominent opponents of Trump, but more importantly, had engaged in their own kind of lawfare or mishandling of classified information.
I think that the indictment, to the extent the allegations are true, is totally damning, and it seems like a pretty clear and cut case here. I think probably the most brutal part is that Will referenced some of his quotes about mishandling of classified information on the media and how cavalier people would be should they engage in such acts and how serious they are and the national security damage, et cetera. And the indictment itself chronicles all manner of quotes from Bolton saying exactly that. And then, of course, juxtaposes that with him engaging in the exact conduct that he was criticizing. So it's just brutal. I mean, he's hoisted on his own petard within the four corners of the indictment. Also, the irony that this was someone who was extremely hawkish on Iran, and yet his communicating this information potentially ended up in the hands of that adversary. And to what end, we don't even know yet. Perhaps that'll come out during the pendency of the case to some extent, what the damage was there. And then there's one other element to this as well that's worth noting, which is that there's reporting to suggest, and I'm not sure if there's been further developments on this, but there's been reporting to suggest that essentially the FBI under the Biden administration sat on all of this. If that's the case, that's very telling because it suggests, obviously, that they didn't bring a prosecution against someone who was essentially a political asset for them. Because here you have a Republican, sort of traditional foreign policy establishment figure who, of course, can be used to attack Trump. And he was valuable to them as someone who would not be indicted, not face prosecution. So it's remarkable and disgraceful all around. And then, of course, there's the profiting off of the national security secrets, which is also analogous to what happened in the case of Joe Biden and the information that he possessed and that he was using for writing a book as well. So all around disgraceful behavior to the extent it occurred as the indictment lays out. And it's hard to see him not being prosecuted on the merits. But again, we'll have to see with jury selection and what that jury pool looks like, how it ultimately plays out. But people need to face the consequences for being cavalier with their communications of the nation's most treasured secrets. And hopefully there's a deterrent as a consequence of bringing prosecutions like this one going forward.
Well, a couple things are clear from this. One, it doesn't seem like anybody in Washington, D.C. is handling classified information well and appropriately. I mean, think about the line of people who have been discovered to do this, right? Biden, Hillary, Bolton, the group chats with the VP and Secretary of War that were sent directly to a reporter. The guy, do you guys remember that case a couple years ago where there was a low-ranking military guy who was able to walk into a top secret facility and print off documents regarding, I think it was like NATO war plans or something, and drop them into a Discord server, right? It's pretty clear to me that it seems like the baseline in Washington, D.C., and in our government institutions is that we aren't really doing a good job protecting the classified, like really important classified documents relating to important aspects of American governance, which really, by the way, really shed some further, I guess, skepticism on more conspiratorial modes of thought. The fact that they can't even like keep stuff from leaking and they can't keep it out of their enemies' hands and like places where they really have a self-interest to do so. It kind of belies the idea that they could keep something really explosive domestically from the American people for decade after decade after decade. In any case, so that's the baseline here. It seems like in this post-Rubicon world, we have a few different categories of lawfare to me, right? Where you have the very clearly, in some cases, completely frivolous charges filed against political opponents like Donald Trump, right? In jurisdictions where it didn't matter if the charge was because the jury was going to convict anyone named Donald Trump. And then you have and I think Andy McCarthy actually laid this out, like, you have these edge cases because there are things that are clearly where somebody has done something wrong. But you do suspect that this wouldn't be the top of the prosecution pile. I think it's tempting to place this case into selective prosecution, but for the fact that of the way that and what Will and Amber both said, and Ben as well, like the way this came to light is because those documents found their way into the hands of a foreign adversary. And that puts it very much to me like, yeah, he happens to be, because when I first heard about this case, I thought it was going to be more, I guess, frankly, ticky-tack stuff like, oh, he didn't like what he wrote in the book, and maybe he didn't properly clear something through, or I thought maybe he wanted to punish Bolton with the process, right, of going through this indictment. But then when we actually see what's in the indictment that dropped, it's really legitimate stuff. So really hung himself on this one. And I would be surprised if he ends up in jail for it.
All right, I'm next, talking about the left's new hero, Graham Plattner. He's a oyster farmer, as they call him, running for Senate in Maine against Susan Collins. The governor, Janet Mills, has also jumped into the Democratic primary. But this guy was really elevated by progressives. A lot of his team comes from the same camp that was doing digital ads and videos and social media for Zohran Mamdani. He's supposed to be sort of the left-wing populist type candidate. And they've really leaned into the fact that he's sort of this down-home oyster farmer. I'll just start with a little bit about his background, because this guy was not like some working class hero. His dad was a lawyer. His mom was a restaurant owner. He went to private school. Went to GW University, was a bartender at Tune In down in Capitol Hill while he was in college. Eventually joined the military, obviously commend him for his service. And then I guess left because he was kind of disillusioned, and I believe he worked for Blackwater at one point, and then decided to go back to Maine to start this oyster farming company. So kind of an interesting background, but anyway, as soon as Janet Mills got into the race, it was very clear that her team had a bunch of oppo cooked up on Graham Plattner, ready to go and drop on his head, and they did. And it turns out to be pretty juicy oppo. So the first story that came out was about this Reddit account he had where he was making a variety of interesting statements, including saying that all police are bastards, describing himself as a communist. He also described himself as an anti-fascist at one point, part of Antifa. Said rural white Americans actually are racist and stupid, and a whole host of other idiotic comments. And he did a little sort of quasi-apology tour in response to these, saying that, he was just angry at the time and was trying to speak honestly about his frustrations within the political system. And, in some cases said that his views have evolved, which is sort of classic, right? This is the Zohran playbook. Oh, I don't really believe in defunding the police anymore. I just want to reallocate resources to social workers or whatever it is. But then there was another story that dropped this week, which involved his chest tattoo that he got while he was in the military. That is apparently a Nazi tattoo. And I found this saga really fascinating because Plattner's team apparently noticed that a video of him with the tattoo on his chest at a family member's wedding, sort of drunkenly miming Miley Cyrus lyrics, which is kind of strange in and of itself. But they decided to sort of try to get ahead of the story by going on Pod Save America and having him answer the question directly of whether or not this was a Nazi tattoo. And he said, I was in the military, and me and my buddies, we got really drunk, and we went to this tattoo parlor in somewhere in Europe, and I'm sure someone can recalls what country it was, but they picked what they thought was like the scariest looking skull and crossbones tattoo, and they all got it. He sort of skates over whether or not he found out at any point that this was a Nazi tattoo. He doesn't talk about wanting to get it removed or regretting that decision. He just kind of hand waves it away and is like, yeah, I was just drunk military guys doing their thing. Well, then in a follow-up interview, after people are still rightfully criticizing him for this, because he's had the thing for 20 years, he goes, oh my gosh, like, I'm so regretful of this. I am going to get it removed. I had no idea. But then there's additional reporting that indicates that he was actually bragging to friends privately about his Nazi tattoo. So he barely knew what it was, didn't care to get it covered up, and is now sort of trying to massage the story in his favor. But the reason I wanted to talk about this candidate, because it's like, okay, Maine Senate candidate, he's getting opposition research, what else is new, is this is leading to something of a civil war among the Democrats. You've seen a lot of progressives online similarly hand waving the Nazi tattoo, saying that this is all just establishment Dems trying to take out their working class populist hero. Of course, these same people did not extend the same grace to the Young Republicans chat. Or I remember in Trump's first term, there was an ICE agent who had some kind of tattoo, maybe it was an Iron Cross, where they falsely accused him of being a Nazi. And a New Yorker reporter actually had to resign for that after they found out what the tattoo actually was. And then you've got the sort of establishment Democrat wing who is like, no, this is actually disqualifying and we shouldn't run someone who sort of gleefully had a Nazi tattoo on his chest for 20 years. So it's just a very interesting case study of the divisions among the left and the narratives that kind of spring up around people. And I'm curious in y'all's thoughts on what this kind of means for the broader party, how analogous this is to Zoran Mamdani, which I know we're going to get into in Inez's segment as well. And also whether this is a gift for Janet Mills or ultimately for Susan Collins in the Maine Senate race. So I'll open it up to the group to address really any part of it that you wish.
Yeah, we had a big to-do about Elon Musk, throwing out his heart to the crowd, and apparently people accusing him of like throwing a Nazi salute. And yet it seems like the media was a lot more interested in that than they are about a Senate candidate who has a literal Nazi tattoo on his chest. I actually don't think the guy's probably a Nazi, so I guess that's probably why the mainstream media is not really covering it. Like he looks like an Antifa leftist, which they're fine with apparently, even though Antifa leftism is, as appalling in my view. There's nothing particularly better about it. It's the ideology underlying communism responsible for hundreds of millions of deaths in the world. So no thanks. And so I hope this guy loses. It seems like Susan Collins just has this ability to pick the best opponents, or the worst opponents in the world pick her. She has a remarkable ability to just sail through. Every year they think they're going to get her, and every year she's like sends some new Democrat challenger to political oblivion, despite being in a blue state. She really just, Susan Collins, I have a lot of respect for Susan Collins, and even though she doesn't always vote the way we want her to, whatever, like every vote we get out of her seat is gravy, because if it were anybody else in that seat, we would just never get a Republican vote for anything.
Yeah, I also don't think this guy is a Nazi. Actually, the story is kind of funny and endearing, to be honest. I'm not particularly concerned about the Nazi leanings of this guy. His other actual ideological commitments, as well pointed out, are actually way more disturbing than some, drunken story from 20 years ago. And by the way, the tattoo is not, if anybody hasn't seen a picture of it, it's not at all an obvious Nazi. Like, I would not have known. I don't know if any of you guys knew that this was a Waffen SS symbol, because I'm
not well versed in Nazi symbols, I must admit.
This reminds me of the dust up over, just in terms of the unfair coverage. Pete Hegseth has something that isn't a Nazi tattoo, but somebody thought looked like it, right? Which is the Jerusalem cross. I don't know if anyone else here knows Dave Marcus. He also has a Jerusalem cross tattoo on his shoulder. Anyway, there's clearly a double standard in how these things are covered. Some of that double standard, by the way, and the serious piece of history that Will alluded to, is that the way that we've allowed the left to frame the history of the 20th century is completely writing out the monsters that were on the left. And leaving Hitler as the sole monster of the 20th century, which of course he is, but not the sole one, right? There were two monsters on that continent at the same time. And Stalin had as big and a bigger death count. There are things that are, more evil about Hitler and more evil about Stalin, and there's not really a point in juggling it. But I do think it's interesting that the standard American education really does hammer home how evil Hitler was, and basically almost doesn't mention Stalin and the atrocities of the Soviet Union. That has everything to do with the leanings of the left domestically in this country that excused and covered up for the crimes of the Soviet Union and the deaths and the death counts under communism domestically, and had egg on their faces at best, and at worst, they just didn't care. And so that piece of the history never filtered into pop culture in such a way that having a hammer and sickle tattoo would be reacted to in the same way as finding out after the fact that this cool skull-looking thing actually was used by the SS. So that is like the serious piece on the history. In terms of the politics here, I mean, Amber, you would know far better than I would, I think, sort of what the dynamics are, and Will would know better what the political dynamics are in Maine. But I do agree generally with what Will said, that I am much more upset when I see red states sending rhinos and squishes to the Senate than I am in a state where a Republican barely ekes in, and she just seems to be able to hold court the way that Will said, election after election, and every vote that we get from her, despite her being one of the squishiest Republicans, like, she has a reason to be squishy. She's in a blue state. Whereas, same could not be said for some senators from Texas, for example, or from Florida, or some other locations in the country where they have the voting base to be much more reliable and aren't.
Senator Collins is supremely blessed as a political figure to have opponents like these. I think that's the starting point for this conversation. I have to say, I can't get over the Blackwater element to this story, and I look forward to further reporting on that, because that obviously does not square with what you think of when it comes to a potential Democrat nominee for Senate. So interesting to see where that thread ultimately goes. And the last point I'll just underscore on the history is, of course, communists are not thought of and portrayed as the instigating force behind tens of millions of murders, death, poverty, and destruction, because that is where the left's agenda, taken to its extreme and its logical conclusion, gets you. So the way that it's coded is Nazis right, farthest part of the right, and thus somehow the natural conclusion of the conservative agenda, which it's obviously not. But on the other hand, on the left, communism really is the logical extreme. It's terrible for the left's branding to be affiliated with the murderers of tens of millions of people. And so that's why it's Nazis are held up as the worst of the worst, and communists are not treated as nearly equivalent to them. Of course, you can have a debate about who's the worst of the mass murderers of the 20th century, who's responsible for more deaths, more deprivation, etc. But it's been pointed, and it's been, I think there's a systematic effort on the left and the folks writing the history books and teaching the courses to whitewash away communism, because it obviously, and socialism and the rest, because it obviously destroys their brand, and so they can't have it.
All right, with that, we're going to Inez to talk about the latest developments in the New York City mayoral race.
Well, we've only got another couple weeks before we almost certainly elect a communist mayor in New York City, and the finance capital of the world. So, of course, the race is heating up. There's been a number of developments. There are some new polls that show some really interesting light on how New York City and the electorate has changed over time. I'll start with the more basic polls. Generally speaking, it looks like Mondami is closing in on 50%. A lot of polls showing him with 48, 49, 50%. And that really is the sort of the death knell of any serious campaign that could be mounted against him. It looks like they are running out of time. They did not get their act together. There's a lot of critique going around as to whose fault it is. And I'll get into that in a minute. But also there's this new poll that is from, and I want to put an asterisk on this, because honestly, I've never heard of the polling firm. It doesn't have any record. I think it's called Patriot Polls. So it's a new outfit. That doesn't mean it's bad or wrong, but they don't have a track record of being accurate over time. So it's hard to say. That being said, there's some very evocative information. They actually did when I first read this, I was like, what polling company asked these questions? Because they're really good. And I couldn't believe that a polling company had asked these questions. And here there is this new polling company that is doing it, right? So, for example, among American-born New Yorkers, Cuomo wins the race, and Mondami's support is cut in half. Sliwa, the Republican, his support is doubled among American-born New York voters, right? But among foreign-born New York voters, Mondami holds the clear lead. So that is some evidence for the thesis that actually immigration is massively changing the electorate of New York City, even in the past, let's say, 20 years or 10 years. So in the immediate past, political past. And something else I pulled out from the crosstabs of this poll, if only men were voting in New York City, there would be a three-way tie right now between Cuomo, Sliwa, and Mondami. That's kind of interesting as well. And then, of course, there was a pull-out tab by religion, and it actually contradicts some of the headlines that I've seen going around that, for example, the Jewish vote in New York is essentially stayed more or less the same, that they're voting for Mondami. This poll shows them very, very strongly voting for Cuomo, and Mondami's support dropping considerably down among the Jewish vote. And in addition, there's a tab. It doesn't break down anything other than Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish, but there's a tab for other, and Mondami is blowing the top off that other tab, which one might imagine includes Muslims, Hindus, atheists, right? So anyway, some interesting crosstabs on that poll worth pulling out and thinking about how both immigration and sort of structural political things have changed, religious shifts have changed the New York electorate. On that last point, it is another piece of information that should be roiling this race, but isn't really. I haven't seen anything beyond basically the New York Post reporting on it and some people commenting online. A picture appeared with Mondami smiling hand in hand with the unindicted conspirator of the 1993 World Trade Center bombings, Siraj Wahaj. But he's I don't know what the word is. He's a Muslim cleric, a preacher. He testified on behalf of a blind sheikh who did instigate and carry out the World Trade Center bombing in 1993. For our younger audience that doesn't remember that was like the pre-9/11 bombing of the World Trade Center. I think 6 people died in it. It was a major focal point of prosecution. It's sort of unbelievable that we are looking at, just 24 years after 9/11, we're looking at New York City electing a mayor who will pose with the unindicted conspirator from a World Trade Center bombing from 1993. Just incredible commentary on how the city has changed, how the electorate has changed, and frankly, the impact that Muslim immigration has had on New York City. And yeah, I mean, it is like shocking if you just step back for a moment and think about the fact that this city is about to vote for somebody who participated indirectly and couldn't quite be indicted for bombing the World Trade Center. So it's electing someone who will happily pose and smile with that person. Sorry. And then the final sort of wrinkle in this race, we have a debate coming up tonight. We're recording this on Wednesday, is the increasing pressure on the Republican candidate, Curtis Sliwa, to drop out. There's some polling that suggests that Cuomo maybe is within striking distance, that being about 4 points. If everybody else drops out, and now the only person left is Republican candidate Sliwa. Bill Ackman put out, I thought, a really sort of inappropriate, honestly, tweet suggesting that the reason that Sliwa is staying in the race is because the campaign funds are funding his lavish lifestyle and suggesting that he was greedy and corrupt. I thought that was totally uncalled for. He won his primary. There are people running underneath him on the Republican slate. This is a Democrat problem. The Democrats in New York elected Mondami. And by the way, I frankly, I considered voting for Cuomo when the race seemed to be closer. I would have to bring an entire, Dramamine and several, vomit bags with me to try to stomach that. This is a guy who signed the bail reform that is causing a lot of the crime problems in the state and in the city. This is a guy who obviously conducted himself and the state and city extremely badly under COVID and is indirectly responsible for the deaths of thousands of old people. Like, Cuomo hung himself. That's not, his record condemns him. And the fact that he wants to come in at the last minute and think that he's owed the mayorship of the city because of his family history in New York and in New York City. I mean, it all has the whiff of the loser. It has the whiff of the 2015 primaries and the Republican Party. He is not even bothering to mount a serious campaign. His message on Zohran isn't that he's hanging out with terrorists and unindicted co-conspirators. His message is, oh, he's too young, he doesn't have any experience, he hasn't had a job. It's so weak sauce. The whole thing is so weak sauce. And yeah, I mean, the writing's on the wall as far as I'm concerned. Maybe Sliwa can pull out a miracle, but sort of doubt it. But at least I'll be keeping my conscience clean and not voting for Cuomo, because he doesn't deserve it, and he doesn't act like he deserves it.
I totally agree, Inez, and I've been loving your tweets about this. And by the way, the argument never goes in the other direction. It's never, well, Andrew Cuomo should drop out because, first of all, he ran against the incumbent Democratic mayor who had to leave his party because he dared to cooperate with Trump on immigration enforcement. And then when he lost the Democratic primary, he decided to jump into the race as an independent. So Curtis Sliwa apparently has the responsibility to save the Democratic Party, but Andrew Cuomo doesn't have the responsibility to save New York by doing the right thing and accepting his loss because he ran a terrible campaign and moving on. It's just wild how the burden is supposedly on probably the only person in the race who actually cares about the future of the city.
Yeah, I'm really sympathetic to this view. Like, I think Ackman's out of line, and I like Bill Ackman a lot, but I think he's out of line here because he's probably just frustrated that he can't beat Mamdani. But Cuomo, I'm sorry, like, what is his pitch to Republicans exactly? Like, and what is the pitch of these New York Democrats to Republicans more broadly? Like, has there been any accountability for all the crap that the New York Democratic Party, with people like Cuomo, put Donald Trump and his associates through? Was there any complaining about the fact that Alvin Bragg and Letitia James were like unleashing unbelievable lawfare against the Trump organization? What do Republicans owe Democrats in New York City? I'm sorry. In fact, I think the best outcome here, I'm starting to think, is to get, let Mamdani win. And then all the Republicans can go to New Jersey, and that's a state we can win. Great. Like, I think we, force emigration out of the state from the conservative-minded people. But I don't think it's on New York Republicans to save the Democrats from themselves. If Cuomo was really serious about Mamdani not being an option, then there should have been formal endorsements of Sliwa from any number of Democrats. But if they're not willing to do that, if they expect Republicans to come up and vote for the guy who insulted them repeatedly, if they expect Republicans to vote for a guy who lost his own primary, like, give me a break.
That's another aspect. I mean, Cuomo told everybody who believes in the Second Amendment to leave New York City.
And now he's facing the consequences of it.
And now he wants to vote for him.
That is one of the ironies, of course, also dating back to the COVID era policy, is that you had a mass exodus of sane or relatively sane New Yorkers to places like Florida. So it'd be interesting to see the analysis of what would this mayoral race look like had those people not left as a consequence of the Cuomo policies in large part. And it is ironic, of course, that my home state of New Jersey could end up being an indirect or even direct beneficiary of the disaster that's about to befall New York City. I do think it's worth noting, if I didn't see the first debate in full between the candidates, but there was a snapshot, I think, of the Young Turks and the future, if not the present, of the Democrat Party, which is radical sophists with a smile on their face that serves as a facade to cover up what is basically the Marxist Islamist agenda of Mamdani. Again, behind a smiley face and with all the branding that he has to cover it up and put a nice veneer over it, versus the very tired establishment voice of Cuomo, sort of begging people to go along with him without putting forth anything very compelling. And I think it was actually a very apt and illustrative snapshot of where the Democrat Party is. And I wrote in a book 5 years ago that I thought that Ilhan Omar looked like the future, if not the present, of the party. And I think we're going to continue to see these figures pick off and take out the Democrat establishment until they are the Democrat establishment. And we're very close to being there already. And that's why the likes of a John Fetterman now looks like a right winger within that party, and is without a party when he was perceived as a radical and progressive candidate just a few years ago.
And now we're going to go right back to Ben on whether Congress is finally going to impeach the rogue judges.
Well, and I'll say I'm not sure if Congress is ready to impeach rogue judges yet, but we've covered before some of the articles of impeachment that have been brought forth in a handful of instances by a few different Republican members of the House. But this week, Chip Roy filed articles of impeachment with a total of 14 co-sponsors, which I think is pretty significant. And we'll see ultimately where leadership shakes out on this. But targeting Judge Deborah Boardman in Maryland. Now, Judge Boardman has presided over a number of absurd cases brought against the Trump administration. But these articles of impeachment were actually pertaining to the sentencing that she called for in the case of the would-be assassin of Justice Brett Kavanaugh, and I think he also threatened the lives of other Supreme Court justices as well. And basically, as you'll recall, Judge Boardman reduced the sentence versus the guidelines to, I think, 8 years when the guidelines called for 30 years for this plot to assassinate a Supreme Court justice. Essentially relying on the fact that this was a transgender person, and out of sympathy, essentially, for the quote-unquote gender identity of the would-be perp here. So the articles of impeachment were filed on a number of levels in terms of justifying the high crimes and misdemeanors, failing to consider the planning of the assassination, the defendant's research in locating the residences of several Supreme Court justices, and Congressman Roy and others say that she violated her oath to the Constitution, duty of impartiality to the American people, abused her judicial authority, and allowed her political ideology to undermine the codified statute to issue a low prison sentence. Now, these articles of impeachment also come on the heels of calls for impeachment from senior senators on the Senate Judiciary Committee, including Ted Cruz and Mike Lee. After this absurd sentence was handed down, Senator Tom Cotton as well put forth a bill that would, quote, prevent judges from using perceived gender identity as a factor when determining the length of a sentence, and another that would prohibit housing transgender inmates with members of opposite biological sex. So there is an element here of gender identity or using identity to then dictate sentences. And we saw this, by the way, also. There was a case out of Minnesota during the Summer of Love BLM riots, where a judge reduced the sentence for an arson in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, essentially by saying that he was a social justice advocate, and this was how social justice advocates sometimes act in response to conditions that they disagree with. And we've seen, and there are other instances around the country as well, of courts reducing sentences based upon essentially political ideology, not the underlying facts and how those facts match up against the sentencing guidelines. So, whether or not Judge Boardman is impeached or not, the fact there are 14 co-sponsors here, that you have multiple members on the Senate side who are talking about this, makes me at least cautiously optimistic that maybe we're going to get towards the time where we normalize the impeaching of judges who act in ways that destroy the judiciary system and the rule of law, because obviously getting smacked down by superior courts isn't doing it. It's not leading to any sort of chastening of the insanity that's coming from these district court judges. So I think ultimately, I believe that Congress is going to have to act. And every judge who engages, who puts forth decisions like this, I think should face the penalty of impeachment. There should be political consequences to it, because that might be something that actually leads to a change of behavior, or maybe it makes the superior courts jump and actually sanction these lower court judges. Something has to be done, because the status quo, I think, is simply untenable for the rule of law in this country. So I'd say kudos to those in the House who are much more seriously considering now filing articles of impeachment and holding these judges to account in courts that Congress created.
Yeah. I think, we talk sometimes jokingly about impeaching judges. Judge Boardman should be impeached. There's just no question about it. And I think that there's a lot of problems with the way federal judges are going about these things, the sort of trivialization of violence against people, the idea that you would give people differing sentences because the way that they were treated in terms of their gender identity is just utter nonsense. It's totally lawless. It's a fundamental disrespect to the Supreme Court and the institutions of our country, and it's dangerous too. It leads to, I mean, we need to do something about the assassination of the culture in this country, and part of that is having really, really forceful sentences for people who've tried to assassinate people. I remember actually when I was in law school and I was interning at the federal district court in the District of Columbia, I got to witness the sentencing of an Idaho man who had taken the bus, or no, he drove all the way from Idaho with a rifle. He parked on Pennsylvania Avenue and he shot a few times in the White House, probably, which is a long distance. We're talking like a 600-yard shot. He just shot a few bullets at the White House, nearly missed one of the snipers on the roof, but that's, he wasn't actually aiming anything. He was just shooting at the White House. Crazy person, believes some totally psychotic things about, the Illuminati and the Rothschilds, you name it. I remember being in there and he's super apologetic in his sentencing, asking for, oh, please, have mercy on me. I didn't know what I was doing. I was kind of crazy. Maybe give me 10, 15 years. And the judge was like, nope, here's 30 years, because you shot at you shot at the White House. You tried to kill the president. Your attempt was going to fail, but you tried. So guess what? 30 years. That was right. 8 years? No, absolutely not. This man, took an Uber with his tools to go to and made it to Kavanaugh's house and then gave up when he realized he couldn't do it. But that was sufficient. He would have tried. And his not just Kavanaugh, but his wife and kids too. 30 years minimum. And the failure to do that by Boardman is impeachable.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Will said, especially in this climate. There needs to be tough sentencing for assassination attempts and for political violence. And yeah, so I agree with that part. I do, allow me to be the squish for a moment. I do worry about the precedent. Essentially, impeachment is a tool that hasn't been used very much against judges, except for totally unrelated concerns. I think it will probably suck when every judge who makes a politically controversial decision will have to worry about impeachment. I do think that will damage the rule of law. I just don't see any way around it, because the rule of law has already been damaged, like with all of these Rubicon type issues, right? There's very little way to put the genie back in the box back in the bottle once one crosses this road. And unfortunately, these lower court judges in this case and in others are abusing their power in a way that demands impeachment as a remedy. And that, yeah, I don't know, maybe it's just allowing my squish moment, but it makes me sad. I really don't think this is going to be good for the judiciary. I don't think this is going to be good for the balance of power between the three branches of the federal government. I don't think this is going to be, I don't think this is good for the country. It's what's necessary, but it's not good for the country. Let me just add one addendum on the issue that Cotton filed the bill on surrounding gender identity being used not only as a mitigating factor in this sentencing, but also something that is afflicting the federal penitentiary. So there are so many inmates male inmates who identify as female in federal custody, that if they were all granted, let's say, housing on prison housing on the basis of their gender identity, which the Biden administration was doing, they would make up 15% of the female inmates in this country, right? So this is not a small number of inmates, by the way. They're, even for being in jail in federal prison, they are disproportionately sex offenders. About half of them have some kind of sex crime on their records. Most of them do not have any long history of identifying as female. But as shocking as it is, to think about, this has been going on for years in this country. We have had male sex criminal inmates making appeals to the court that they are female and should be housed, and are granted their requests to be housed among female inmates. This has been happening in a bunch of states. It was happening under federal guidelines under Biden. It's still happening. We are transferring sex offender males into female prisons. And there have been sexual assaults and pregnancies and all the attendant problems you might imagine comes with transferring male sex criminals into female prisons. So this is something that is almost like it's hard to push as an issue because people don't believe it's happening because it sounds so insane, but it is happening. It has been happening for quite a few years now, including in New York State, including in Jersey, including in California, including in Maine. All of those states have transferred male inmates. So yeah, that's where we're at. And just because we don't talk about it, it just hasn't, the sports issue has been so front and center. And so at least it's getting airtime. This is so crazy that when you start describing it to people, I wrote a report for this for independent women. You start describing this and what's happening to people, they just think you're crazy and that you're making it up.
That's so true. I've been receiving letters from female inmates for years, begging the media to cover their plight of being stuck with men in their prisons. And of course, the explanation for these male to female supposedly identifiers the explanation for them being disproportionately represented would be very dissatisfying to the left, because one reason would be potentially that trans people are more apt to commit crimes. And the second reason, which is probably more likely, is that men, particularly sex offenders, will say that they're female to potentially get an easier prison stay and to get access to women. So it's just sort of just another example of data and reality just completely blowing apart the whole transgender ideology. With that, we'll move to final thoughts, and I'm going to give Ben the first shot here.
Thanks. So I think in a recent episode, we might have briefly touched on Barack Obama hailing these quote unquote democracy defending figures in Poland and Hungary, which is another way of saying that he's trying to extend his control globally and fight against anyone and everyone around the world who would dare fight against the progressive globalist agenda that he foisted on America and tried to foist on the world. Well, he's also been focused domestically as well, shattering yet another norm in his activism as an ex-president. And the Washington Post has a profile, of course, it's a positive view of him and how he's been highly engaged in the redistricting fights going on, including being a key force behind the California redistricting gambit to try and counter the actions of the likes of Texas and other states. I think it's worth noting that Barack Obama has always wanted to continue exerting influence. This goes from his 2 terms through Russiagate, through then all of his minions essentially staffing up the Biden administration, with a few exceptions as well. And now it continues here. He can't help but seek to control our body politic. So another norm absolutely shattered by Obama. But I also think it's worth noting the focus on redistricting. It's not really talked about, but former Attorney General Eric Holder, his key focus after leaving that office was to go into redistricting battles on behalf of the Democrat Party. He fought vehemently against the census citizenship question that the Trump administration sought to include in the census during Trump 1. He continues to fight on redistricting, including in California. And it's a tell, I think, that this profile in the Washington Post details Barack Obama and Eric Holder's machinations around redistricting. It shows you that for Democrats, this is the whole ballgame. They've gerrymandered every map they could possibly control. And now that Republicans are trying to finally combat that and rebalance the map and have it more accurately reflect where the American public is, and combat, of course, the machinations, the shenanigans around the census itself, you have Barack Obama engaging behind the scenes and publicly as well. So I think what that should show to Republicans is that now is the time to go for the jugular. If you can redraw maps consistent with what is actually fair and legal standards, which of course those standards are changing in real time as the Supreme Court grapples with certain of the relevant issues here. This is a real opportunity to change the political ballgame and change the calculus for a generation, if not longer. And as we're recording, actually, news came out that North Carolina had just redrawn its map with one district. It looks like shifting red under the redrawn map. That's obviously going to be challenged in the courts. But this is going to be a massive issue and maybe one of the most significant developments in the 4 Trump years. And with the Trump administration pushing it, will be for red states to get redder in their representation and rebalance the maps ultimately for the benefit of the American people and to combat the gerrymandering and the rigging that Democrats have been doing for decades with the electoral map.
I would like to go next, but I actually have an unconventional request, which is I want to cede my time to Will because I don't know what he had planned to talk about, but I really hope it's this Mehdi Hassan church bells versus Islamic call to prayer issue that he has been tweeting about. And I just want you to take it away from there.
All right. Fair enough. Yeah. So Mehdi Hassan is like my new favorite Twitter antagonist. Like he just can't help but respond to whatever you say. You know, he wrote a book called Win Every Argument, and that literally defines his Twitter style. He has to win every argument, so he can't let anything go. But he posted this thing, or somebody else posted, I think it was a clip of him before he spoke at No Kings, where he's trying to compare. He's saying, you know, somebody asked him about the call to prayer in the United States. He's like, yeah, we should get the call to prayer in the United States because if you guys get church bells, we should get the call to prayer. And it's like, that's actually quite offensive, really. The call to prayer, if you've ever been to any Arab country and heard it, or you've been to Israel, for example, and heard it in Jerusalem.
I heard it in Alexandria, Virginia. I woke up at 5 a.m. and I was like,
oh, I'd be infuriated. Oh my God. But it's jarring. I actually have a broader thesis, which is that part of the backwardness of the Muslim world is a result of them depriving themselves of sleep with the call to prayer. And, you know, we do all these studies now that show the importance of getting proper uninterrupted sleep, and yet their entire society is structured in a way that precludes them from doing that. No wonder things aren't going so well. And it also implicates whether or not their religion is in fact true, if everybody's miserable and not functioning very well under it. But anyway, the broader point being that, like, no, we don't want the call to prayer in the United States. It's alien, it's domineering, it's an attempt to, I would describe it as sonic imperialism. It's the attempt to kind of impose your way of viewing the world through sound in the mornings. You know, if you actually, once I realized that because I was in Israel and I was, you know, at the tourist sites, kind of on the east side of, in the middle of Jerusalem, the David, I forget the city of David. And right across the way is a Palestinian neighborhood, and they have like big air horns targeted at the tourist sites, blasting the call to prayer at you across like an open valley. So they're not trying to alert their residents that, oh, it's time for you to go pray. They're trying to impose their will on the tourists there who aren't there. So, and it's like that for, you know, every Jewish resident who is near any sort of Islamic area, like they get to hear the call to prayer at 5:30 in the morning, just like everybody else does. It's a way of essentially being obnoxious and reminding everybody that you're there. So that all being said, call to prayer shouldn't be in the United States. It's alien to our traditions. It's obnoxious. If you want to live in a society with a call to prayer as a Muslim, go live in a Muslim country. But Mehdi was, you know, so I said something to that effect that, you know, obviously my general theme is that he should be denaturalized and deported back to Britain so he can live in an Islamist country. You know, and then this morning his favorite thing, he doesn't have that many insults, sadly. You know, for all the Oxford training, he just is like his vocabulary of insults is quite limited. It's Ku Klux Klan, racist, fascist. So today it was Ku Klux Klan, and I pointed out that, you know, it's strange that he sees that as an insult, given that he forces his wives to wear similar attire. And so he's pretty upset about that. I think that was my best one-liner of the day. But yeah, I'm going to keep bickering with Mehdi Hassan because he's much bigger than me in terms of numbers, and he can't stop arguing with me. And he's just a wonderful. He's a terrible. He's really bad at actually arguing. He can't help but promote more of my stuff to the point that the entire right has now agreed that he should be out of the country.
It's so awesome. And you were ratioing him pretty hard. I mean, the whole like church bells versus Islamic call to prayer. My husband and I went on our honeymoon to Morocco. So yes, we were woken up by the call to prayer. And Morocco, for, you know, all of its some of its faults. It's actually a very beautiful country, but is one of the more accepting of other religions than most Islamic countries. But still, I mean, you get the megaphones, of course, everywhere, especially in tourist areas. But church bells signify the start of a religious service. Sometimes they have clock towers that denote the time. But the Islamic call to prayer is a specific statement of religious superiority, right? Like it is actually making a claim that Allah is the one true God, that Muhammad is the prophet. And so forcing everyone around you to have to hear that 5 times a day, I think is actually in conflict with the religious freedom argument that he's making. And also, as our lovely producer points out, I would never complain about the call to prayer in Morocco because I was in an Islamic country and I knew that that's what I would have to encounter. It's just amazing how so many people, they'll complain that America hates Muslims, and then they will deliberately move to America with the intent of colonizing it and forcing it to become a majority Muslim country, when they would, of course, be horrified and furious if that ever went in the other direction. It's just pure disrespect for our country and for our values, and they should be shamed into oblivion.
Yeah, I have to say, like that was one of the most shocking moments of my life. You're groggy at 5:30 in the morning, but having heard the call to prayer in Israel, it was just very. I had this moment of waking up, and I had just moved too, so I just had this moment of waking up and being like, "Where am I?" But it was Alexandria, Virginia, another place with a very high Muslim population. My final thought is an update on victories, at least small victories against universities. Harvard had to cut a bunch of its PhD programs in light of budget insecurity from a big settlement with the Trump administration and continued threats of withholding federal grants. Like almost all universities, Harvard is completely dependent on those grants and those federally backed loans to run shop, and also the smaller than it should have been endowment tax in the One Big Beautiful Bill also factored into Harvard's decision that they do not have the budget for a lot of their programs, and so they have started the cuts. You love to see it. It's great. The compact that President Trump offered a lot of universities, notably not the top Ivies, but universities that have shown some willingness to work with the Trump administration on, I don't know, rectifying their obvious violations of federal civil rights law. They have offered what I think is a very reasonable olive branch compact. All but 2 so far of the universities offered that compact have rejected it. I think today or tomorrow is the final deadline. But I hope the Trump administration keeps trying with those compacts, because actually it would be very good to have some examples rather than, it's always good to have a carrot and a stick in these kinds of negotiations. But the universities have handed an endless number of sticks to the Trump administration, and they will beat them with every single one of them until they submit. And it's just a matter of time. And what's happening at Harvard is an early indication of that.
All right, so that is going to do it for us this week. On behalf of Will, Inez, and Ben, I'm Amber Duke, and we will see you at the next NatCon Squad.